In the months that followed, while a brutal war was raging in Iraq, Moscow was calling for peace. Moscow tried to call for peace and attempted to host talks between the warring parties, but the fighting raged on. The Gulf War was almost a modern-day world war because although it was commanded by the United States, more than 30 nations joined in as the coalition force against Iraq. They wanted to stop Iraq's invasion and annexation of Kuwait and ultimately control the rising oil pricing which had skewed global consumption and production. By this time, I had come across solid evidence that proved that Richard had manipulated this entire warfare and had previously tried to hijack an American warship, the USS Roosevelt destroyer, and used his mercenary teams to launch an unprovoked attack on Iraq, making it appear as though the United States government was behind this. Fortunately, Moscow was able to halt the USS Roosevelt from docking at Iraq's harbor, but they couldn't prevent the war in the Gulf region. This was due to the influence Richard had on many senior officials in the Senate and House of Representatives. One of the men Richard met with repeatedly was Frank Ashcroft, the Assistant Secretary of State for International Affairs, who supported Richard's idea of invading Iraq. Ashcroft was a major shareholder in Richard's private oil company, and both men were likely to profit from the outcome of this war. But I didn't want to depend on circumstantial evidence alone, so I immediately flew to Richard's office in Washington, D.C. and asked him to explain the voice recording. It was a clear audio of him calling the Kremlin's legislative switchboard and telling them how a Soviet submarine was hijacked near the Gulf of Finland. This was shortly after Moscow successfully thwarted Richard's attempt to use the American warship as a decoy to attack the sovereign nation of Iraq. I accused Richard of playing with people's lives. But he rebutted my argument and protested that he only made that call to Moscow to give them information about the hijacked submarine because his close friend had asked him to do it. "Who is this friend you are talking about?" Richard ran a hand over his thinning hair and replied heavily. "Dear boy, you do not know him personally, but he is a very charismatic leader, one who would stop at nothing to get what he wants." "Who is it?" W.H. Buccaneer. "The Undersecretary for Political Affairs," Richard answered simply. "We work together in the Department of State. You expect me to believe that Buccaneer was responsible for hijacking the American warship and almost attacking Iraq without authorization?" I shook my head in exasperation. "I don't expect you to believe it, son, but it is the truth. It was your voice on the tape," I insisted. "Yes, it was," Richard admitted easily. "And I made that phone call to Kremlin because Buccaneer asked me to do it. He had been using me the entire time." "I don't believe that. The mercenaries who were hired to hijack the Soviet nuclear submarine were actually your employees. I saw the money trail go directly from your offshore bank account." "Ah, but you should know, Buccaneer and I shared some of those accounts a long time ago. He was probably using my login credentials." "If you are right, then I want to talk to your friend Buccaneer." Richard nodded heavily. "We will go to meet him at once, because I will also make him pay for what he did to me." He spoke with sudden emotion and zeal, and I almost believed in the possibility that Richard was being framed for the crimes. W.H. Buccaneer takes his lunch break across the Constitution Gardens. We will find him there. Before we exited Richard's apartment, I saw him reach below his table and recover a small gun that was attached to the bottom of the wooden desk. He slid a silencer over the barrel and slipped the weapon inside his suit jacket. I didn't ask him the reason for carrying a weapon, but it appeared unusual for an old man to arm himself with lethal round, especially since we were in one of the most secure cities in the world. As we walked across the National Mall Road, Richard told me how he undertook numerous trips to the Gulf region in order to restore peace and prevent the war. I didn't know whether to trust what he said or not, but I knew if I was able to speak with Buccaneer, many of my unanswered questions would be finally solved. W.H. Buccaneer was a thin, tall man. He was seated gracefully at the park bench on the grassy lawn and enthusiastically got to his feet when he saw Richard. The two men exchanged warm greeting and were speaking in low tones. I approached nearer and introduced myself. Buccaneer looked confused at my presence and shot a bewildering glance at Richard. "It's all right," Richard told his friend. "This kid works for me. He was accompanying on this walk and we happened to spot you here." I was startled to hear the lie and quickly interrupted Richard. "Mr. Buccaneer," I said as respectfully as I could. "I recently came across some evidence that showed that Richard used his money to fund Eastern European terrorists who had tried to hijack the Soviet nuclear submarine early last year right after the fiasco with the USS Roosevelt." "Those are classified information, son," Buccaneer interrupted me. "Where does your source get this intel from?" I ignored his question and asked him if it was true that he used money from Richard's account to hire mercenaries to hijack the submarine. Buccaneer looked shocked to hear the question, and before he could respond, Richard pulled the weapon from beneath his jacket's lapel and shot the old man directly in the forehead. I could hear the impact of the bullet smashing the diplomat's skull, but before I could even react, the man was dead. The cold sandwich he was eating for lunch slipped from his hands and fell on the grassy ground. I looked helplessly at Richard. I knew he was Irina's stepfather, but I could not keep my voice respectfully calm. "What the hell did you do that for?" I shouted. Richard calmly replaced his gun in his inner jacket pocket and answered calmly. "Men like Buccaneer make me sick. They are lying, sniveling bastards who spend their whole life framing others for their crimes." "But that is exactly why I came here with you," I said furiously. "I wanted to ask him the questions myself and find out if he really framed you. Why did you shoot him in the public?" "If you think for 1 second that Buccaneer would have told you the truth about any of this, then you are more naive than I thought. I put his lying and miserable life to an end. You should be thanking me for killing a traitor like that." "But you cannot carry out extrajudicial killing," I protested. "You executed the Undersecretary for Political Affairs inside Washington, D.C. and right in front of the Lincoln Memorial. It was wrong." "Let me tell you what is exactly wrong, young man. You don't understand what these corrupt bureaucrats of Washington are capable of. Undersecretary Buccaneer single-handedly tried to attack Iraq, bypassing Soviet security patrol, and then framed me for the entire episode. I had every moral reason to kill him." After hearing Richard speak so passionately about this, I decided not to argue with him. On our journey back to Langley, Richard gave me a detailed account and explanation of what happened during and prior to the Gulf War. I was almost convinced he was innocent. He showed me evidence of how W.H. Buccaneer tried to carry out all those sabotage operations and used his account to fund those operations so that it would look as though Richard had carried out the hijacking of the Soviet nuclear-powered submarine. Richard's excuses were making sense, so I didn't argue further. After all, the only witness I had, the only man who could have verified or corroborated Richard's statements was Buccaneer, and he was already dead. Reluctantly, I apologized to Richard for blaming him and accusing him of being the mastermind of the terrorist attack on Iraq and the sabotage of the submarine, and to my surprise, he was genial to me and readily forgave me for my previous outburst. A year later, I became desperate to calm my conscience and decided to pay another visit to my dear mother's resting place. Too much had happened in my life, and I was eager to share my challenges and adventures with my mother, who I knew was watching over me through all these years. Visiting the burial place of my mother was both a painful and an emotional experience for me because of the traumatizing event that had taken place several years earlier. It was shortly after I had arrived in America and was still reporting to my supervisor at the camp when I was granted untraceable traveling documents. I was elated and seized the opportunity to fly to London and see the auspicious ground beneath which my mother was buried 2 decades ago. But everything did not go as planned. What was supposed to be a sentimental visit turned into a violent brawl because I had been followed. And my enemies saw that I regularly paid visit to a particular graveyard in London. This caused them to become suspicious, and once I returned to the States, a caretaker of the cemetery called to inform me that numerous unidentified workers were breaking the headstone on my mother's grave. This news felt like a knife to my ear. I was told that the workers had a 6-ton grave digging machine with them and were trying to exhume the grave. I was continents away, powerless to stop the horrible dishonorable criminals, but I phoned London police and begged them for help. My mother's resting place was being desecrated and I needed it to stop. One of the police chiefs agreed and they were able to send a patrol car to the scene and chase away the grave diggers. The intruders fled from the scene, but I knew the men who had come to dishonor this sacred grave would be back and would try again. So, the next morning, I flew to London and began the most difficult task of my life. To keep my mother safe. In some of the last entries of her diary, my mother wrote about her parents and her family members. It was all strange to me, because I had never met any one of them. I never saw my maternal uncles, aunts or grandparents. I didn't even know if I had living cousins in the Soviet Union. Two locations were mentioned most frequently in my mother's diary, Moscow and Grozny. From her journals, I learned that her father was from Grozny and some of her distant relatives lived near the village of Samashki in the west of Chechnya. Her father had passed away a long time ago and was buried in a family graveyard several kilometers from Grozny, and in one passage, my mother had written that it was her impossible wish that she would be resting in the afterlife beside her father, grandmother and other family members. When I reread this diary entry, I knew what I had to do. London was too dangerous for my mother. She was not safe here. I had to move her from this graveyard and allow her to rest somewhere more peaceful and a place that will not be lonely. She would be happier if she spent eternity in the company of her deceased family members in Grozny. I proceeded with this task at once, and I personally oversaw the delicate task of exhuming her remains by licensed workers and transporting them in an airtight coffin. The rented private jet I hired transported my mother's coffin to her father's native Grozny. I knew the location of her family's graveyard in the area, where numerous members of her family were laid to rest, including my maternal grandfather. As I helped the workers carry the bier to this new place, I hoped that somehow she would find some comfort in knowing that her blood relatives were lying beside her. That she was not alone in this violent and unsacred world. Since that day, I have been returning to this spot several times each year and told my mother about all the work I have been doing. It was early 1994 when I made this particular visit. As per the usual protocol, I switched planes 3 times, detoured the rented vehicle and arrived at the secret holy spot. I was so careful to make sure no one in the world would find out about my mother's new burial place. Dramatic events began to unfold less than a week after I visited my mother's family graveyard in the USSR. When I returned to the United States, Richard informed me that an impending war was breaking out in the Russian border and civil unrest was growing exponentially against the leadership. This was a shock to me, for when I was in St. Petersburg and Grozny, everything seemed so calm and peaceful. I didn't believe Richard at first, but I was told that a trinational war was about to start after a former Soviet Air Force general received overwhelming popular support from the local population and won the Chechen election. As soon as he was made the president, he declared independence from the former Soviet Union. This act was considered treasonous to the Soviet leadership and they sent in Russian troops to Grozny to restore order. I was at a loss as to what to do. The thought of another war wrecking my mother's homeland was frightening. I discussed our options with several of my superior officers in the intelligence bureau. Pentagon officials insisted that the United States military would not intervene in a Soviet domestic matter, but I was becoming impatient every time I saw the news. Hundreds of ethnic Russian civilians were dying in the gunfire exchanges. Then to my surprise, Richard agreed to let me fly to Moscow and meet with a few of his contacts who worked at the State Duma. They were against this war and was eager to broker peace talks between Chechen leaders and their Soviet counterparts. It was difficult to imagine that the Chechen conflict was one of the first major warfare to take place in the region after the dissolution of Soviet Union, and when I landed at the Nizhny Novgorod International Airport on a freezing morning, I felt deeply nostalgic remembering all the memories of my youth that was spent here. But I didn't have spare time to think about the past. Richard had informed me that one of his trusted friends was waiting to meet me at an inn near the historic of Tazavadsky district. 3 army officers were drawing up a plan to halt the ground invasion, while an Air Force colonel agreed to hold peace talks and halt bombing on civilian populations. I was inwardly grateful to Richard for allowing me and Dustin to travel to Russia and help restore peace. Although we had to travel separately, my dear friend Dustin met me at the Moscow's Domodedovo airport and together, we embarked on our transnational journey. He was fortunate enough to bring all his computer equipment along, and as we traveled in rented vehicles, he was careful enough to carry his mobile transmitter and satellite interceptor in his large shoulder bag. I was grateful for his presence because I knew Dustin was one of the best code breakers in the world. The brilliant computer programmer had been my colleague during the days I trained at the camp, and many times during our missions, Dustin saved my life. Before meeting our contact, we decided to set base nearby and wait for the morning to begin our work, so the rented car dropped us off at a transit hotel, 30 kilometers southeast of Moscow. Dustin and I prepared for the meeting early the next morning, but before heading out, I contacted Richard as a direct line and alerted him of our coordinates and updated him with our progress. I told him we were about to meet one of his contacts soon. Richard seemed delighted and he said he was hoping the war would end soon. With his blessings, I hired a taxi cab and headed to the rendezvous point. 6 minutes after we got on a freeway, I noticed that the vehicle I was in was being followed. I asked the cab driver to change the lanes, but the rear car tailed close behind. Dustin, who was busy uploading a new software into his portable computer, was oblivious to the imminent danger we were facing, but before I could warn him, the truck that was in front of us halted. Simultaneously, the car behind us rammed into the taxi most brutally, and I could feel the violent impact jolting me in my seat. I quickly looked over at Dustin. The computer hacker was slumped forward, likely unconscious from the impact. The poor driver who was trying to navigate over the icy road appeared dead. I scrambled to the door, but the locks were jammed. I then proceeded to kick the window in order to break out, but a masked man approached the side door and smashed a thick hammer into the glass. The shards flew to my face just as I felt blood trickling down my head. I couldn't remember anything after that. When I awoke, paramedics were loading me on a stretcher. Some eyewitnesses must have alerted the police. As I was wheeled into an ambulance, my mind was restless because all I could think of was how Dustin was doing. I couldn't imagine what I would do if he was hurt. Then I saw him. Dustin was being tended to by a nurse who was wrapping a thick gauze around his head. However, I was relieved to see my friend was conscious and alert. I motioned to the paramedic to halt. "Are you okay, Dustin?" I called out to him. The computer programmer looked at me blankly, as if in a trance. "It's gone," he whispered in anguish. "What is gone, Dustin?" "My computer, all my instruments, all the data I gathered so far. The guys who attacked our car took all of it away." I tried to pacify my friend. "Listen, stop worrying about it now. All that matters is you are safe and alive." Dustin nodded absently. "My data disk is now in their possession. But they will not able to read it." "How are you so sure of it?" I inquired. "Because it was enciphered using a 5,000-byte encryption," Dustin answered happily. "Good work." That means, even with the latest technology, it would take those thieves at least 10 years to decipher the code, even if they used a supercomputer. I smiled weakly as the paramedics wheeled me away. For the next 2 days, I was recuperating in a private hospital. On the 3rd day, Richard contacted me using one of his secure lines. He said he heard about the accident and was worried about my welfare and health. Richard then gave me the contact information of another of his contacts. This mysterious contractor was stationed at a military barrack near the Russian border. NSA stealth satellites captured images of Russian troops moving on Grozny from 3 directions. In December of 1994, the first fighting took place in the village of Lomizyurt nad Turechny, but before the international community could intervene, the violence had escalated out of proportion. From my secure location in a bunker at Svetlograd, I heard the news of terrible carnage taking place in various cities of Chechnya. Dustin successfully pulled up all satellite surveillance of the region, and the landscape was covered with plumes of billowing black smoke. One of the most heartbreaking news I heard was the massacre at the village of Samashki in April of 1995. International news media were reporting that Russian soldiers were torching and pillaging houses and raping and executing civilians. I couldn't independently verify those claims, so I was desperate not to believe it. However, aerial images that I was able to access showed that the village had been reduced to rubbles. A sharp moment of grief plagued my mind as I thought that all members of my mother's distant relatives and family were most likely dead because many of them had lived in that village. I became increasingly desperate to do something strategic that would halt this carnage, and my dear friend Dustin managed to locate a senior Soviet diplomat who had agreed to broker a peace deal. We traveled 200 kilometers northeast of Stavropol and found the man who claimed to be a negotiator. Before I left for Russia, I was shocked as much as the international community to hear that a conflict was brewing and expanding along the Russian border after the Soviet leader decided that Chechnya had been acting in a belligerent manner. Richard had been showing great interest in the development of the civil unrests in Chechnya. On more than one occasion, he told me that there could be a great war soon and we should be prepared for it. At that time, I was confused. "What do you mean, prepare for it?" I had asked Richard. "Oh, I merely meant that we should be passionate spectators, since the war in the Balkans and the Soviet Union does not concern us." "War should always concern us," I reminded him. "Isn't that why we are doing so much work in the NSA? We are doing undercover missions every day to prevent wars and battles from taking place." "Correction," Richard cleared his throat. "We are striving to prevent war from taking place in the West. In North America. Why should it matter to us if Russian denizens bite and quarrel with each other?" Richard's condescending voice made me very upset, but I tried to reason with him yet again. "If you are right and there is a civil unrest about to take place in the Soviet Union, I believe it is our duty to stop it. If we don't act, thousands of civilians could get hurt." "Let those savages kill each other," Richard drawled, but on noticing how pale my face had become, he softened his voice and said, "Don't worry, if situation gets out of control, I am sure the State Department will authorize NSA or the CIA to intervene in some way." One of my former instructors at the camp was the commander of the 131st Makeup Brigade. He was the Soviet officer responsible for sending young soldiers into their death because at the early stages of war, nearly all members of the brigade were destroyed while engaged in an irresponsible attack. My heart bled in pain because I could not bear to see more people getting killed or wounded. But no matter how much I hoped for peace, the battle went on. I felt anger towards the people who had started this terrible war and had no pity on the young troops. They threw them in the line of fire without any consideration. Did they not care if they lost 1,000 in one day? And the most unfortunate part of this war was the civilian casualties in the cities of Chechnya. My third stop was supposed to be at an abandoned textile factory in a sprawling farmland in Rizdestvo, a fertile ground within the Bryansk Oblast. Dustin said he knew 2 other computer engineers who would cooperate with us and somehow use their newly designed software to intercept communication between the troops fighting on the ground. This approach was deemed necessary after Dustin discovered that a large number of foreign nationals entered the former Soviet Union 2 weeks before the conflict in Chechnya began. One of the aerial footages we captured of the incoming belligerents showed that they were traveling in special stealth airplanes belonging to an Austrian weapons manufacturer. I knew the logo that was on the plane. It was the jagged silver line symbolizing the eternal power of the East German secret police. I also recognized one of the men who flew into Russia. He was Werner Lager, an Austrian businessman who was very well acquainted with Irina's stepfather. I wondered why Richard's old friend from Austria was flying into the former Soviet Union just days before a major war broke out in the country. I could come up with no explanation. But Dustin hesitantly told me something that worried me greatly. The computer programmer suspected our communication line was being hacked and intercepted by some third party. When I insisted he explain himself well, he told me that the last 4 rendezvous we had with our Russian contacts had been compromised. I admitted that it was strange, but I could not come up with any reason for that. Maybe our luck ran out. But there is more to this than a sabotage, Dustin had whispered urgently. What do you mean? I said. You didn't notice? Dustin said incredulously. Each time Richard sets up someone to meet with us, we get attacked and our equipment are stolen. Some third party may have overheard us, I suggested. Dustin shook his head vigorously. Impossible, he said flatly. I used the most sophisticated scrambler to make that call to Richard's direct line. There was no way that conversation could have been intercepted. Then what are you saying? I asked, not wanting to think the inevitable. The only way I can explain what has been happening is that Richard sold us out to some mercenaries. You don't get it, Dustin, I calmed my friend. Richard would not want us dead. He sent us here to meet with his contacts so that we could end this war quickly. I don't know, Dustin said uncertainly. All I am saying is that someone has been alerting the criminals of our whereabouts every time you updated Richard on our location. Okay, I know this is difficult. And you may be right. I said. So, what do we do? Dustin asked quickly. Do we cancel the meeting with the computer engineers? No, it's too late for that, I advised. But I won't let you endanger yourself. I will go to the meeting place and make contact with your engineer friends. Okay, what should I do? Dustin wanted to know. Sit tight, I told him. Stay at the safe house. No one knows about this location, so they can't hurt you. I will be back soon. Okay, but take the transmitter with you. Dustin pinned a small button on my jacket lapel. This will let me know if you are okay. Wish me luck. I grabbed my small briefcase and drove an unmarked truck to the meeting location. The warehouse was eerily quiet, and as I entered through a metal gate, the locks were broken. I took out my torchlight and searched the interior. But there was not the faintest noise in the vast warehouse. Only a pungent odor marked the corner of a storage room. I went inside the room to investigate what was causing the smell. I saw a stain of fresh blood on the granite floor. I carefully stepped over the pool of blood and then saw the most ghastly sight in the world. Two young men were lying on the floor. Their bodies were riddled with dozens of bullets. I scanned their clothes with my infrared lighter, but there was no fingerprint anywhere. I had no clue who the perpetrators were. They must have been professionals because they did not leave behind any incriminating evidence in the crime scene. I wanted to stay and call an ambulance, but I knew it was useless. From their cold bodies, I could tell that the two computer engineers had been dead for at least several hours. Then my blood froze as I thought about Dustin. He was all alone in the safe house. My friend was not trained in active combat, and if our location and transmissions had been compromised, he was not safe in that secret location. I ran to the truck and sped back to the safe house. From a kilometer away, I saw dark smoke billowing over the small stone house. I pulled over at a distance and approached cautiously. I prayed so desperately that Dustin would be okay, but when I came nearer, I saw that the door had been blown apart by some sort of explosives. I ignored the smoke and went inside. Dustin was missing. My friend was gone. But there was a Motorola radio transmitter on his desk, which Dustin had recovered from a truck wreckage, and after he worked out the wavelength, he was able to monitor the communications of our enemy. His computer was still on. Before Dustin was taken, he had searched the name of Werner Lager on his desktop. Lager was an Austrian businessman who happened to be Richard's old friend from his Stasi days. There was not much information on Dustin's computer, but I assumed that his kidnapper must have been that Austrian man. My friend had been trying to leave a clue for me behind so that I could try to locate and rescue him. I knew the brilliant code breaker was kidnapped, but I hoped he would still be alive. The programmer would not be killed by ambitious captors. Dustin had too much information in his brains, so his captors would find him more useful alive. But this only meant more terror, because I didn't want to think what sort of torture methods they were going to put the young man through. I had to find him before it was too late. I instinctively wanted to contact Richard for help, but something about what Dustin had told me the day before lingered in my mind. Dustin was sure that it was Richard who had betrayed our location to the criminals, and it was true that an old acquaintance of Richard mysteriously appeared in Russian weeks before a major regional conflict broke out. No, I could not ask him for help. It would put Dustin in more danger. I called the only person I thought I could trust. The man was Captain Peskov, a senior diplomat who had strong influence over the Russian Senate and its lower house, the State Duma. Peskov was my colleague when I trained at the Soviet camp, and we were both selected to conduct active missions in France and Britain. It was still the communist era, and our headquarters were based in East Berlin. During our first week of surveillance and observation mission in West Germany, we were arrested by the West German police and were being held as spies. British agents were brutally interrogating us, and while they were transporting us to a more miserable location, I distracted the 3 guards who were surrounding us and allowed Peskov to escape. He was grateful to me for saving his life and promised to return the favor one day. I searched his name on Dustin's global database and found an untraceable number. The voice that answered sounded very familiar. I wasted no time in exchanging pleasantries and directly asked for his help. I told him what had happened to Dustin and asked him to help me find the computer programmer. Captain Peskov agreed readily. Of course, I remembered Dustin. I wouldn't call him a friend, but only because his computer was his best friend, It's my fault that he is in this mess, I told Peskov. Is there anything you can do to narrow down his location? Yes, I sent you the address to my command center. Please come over. I will give you full access to our intelligence department's tracking system. If Dustin is within the Russian Federation, we will know. Did you have aerial image of this location? I asked. There could be a clue as to who took him. Peskov replied calmly. We have state-of-the-art counter-surveillance detection system in place. So if your hacker friends show up there, they will detect it right away. Okay, and I told you about the Austrian man I began, but Captain Peskov cut me off. That has been taken care of. The KGB wants him as much as you do, and we have a current file photo of Werner Lager and his associates who entered the former Soviet Union illegally. I already put the face prints through KGB's biometric state scanners. We will get a location soon. What about the freeways? I asked again. They probably bundled Dustin in a van or something. That is expected, so I have already linked with Moscow's urban surveillance satellites. Now, we have visual on almost all major routes. I began to thank him for his help, but Captain Peskov brushed off my gratitude. Don't worry, we will find your friend. I breached the perimeter at nightfall. Captain Peskov, who had provided me with the location of this facility, had warned me that the building was heavily fortified with electronic gates and bulletproof windows, but thermal imaging did not yield any significant results. I knew Dustin was being held somewhere inside the rundown building, so I decided to begin my search from the sub-level floors. I searched the ground floor, but it was deserted. However, in one of the generator rooms, I could hear the steady humming of a motor. There was a power source in the facility, which meant someone was running an active base of operations from here. I followed the source of the motor and found a bolted doorway leading to the rear end of the warehouse. Since the door was locked, I had to empty a magazine of bullets from my rifle and managed to break the lock. But all the noise I had caused must have alerted the watch guard. As soon as I went through the metal door, something hit me on the head. It was so heavy that I was certain my skull had been crushed. I sank to the floor and became unconscious.